if you stand back and take a broad view of the disciplines, they've always been there in the Christian life, going all the way back to the Old Testament. They have been a constant in Christian life, Jewish and Christian life. And that's because they're deeply biblical. They're very, very biblical.
Welcome back, everyone, to Breaking Bread, the podcast brought to you by Apostolic Christian Counseling and Family Services. I'm very glad to get back into the conversation with Isaac Funk and Fred Witzig on spiritual disciplines. In particular, we're going to listen as Fred unpacks history. What does history tell us about the spiritual disciplines?
So, Fred, I want you to speak to this a little bit. For those who attach spiritual disciplines to monasticism, can you help untangle maybe the way we typically think about these things and maybe how we should think about it?
Sure. So I'm going to talk first just about where monasticism came from. And I'm going to present it in the best light I can because I think the intentions were good. And I think the Protestant critique of monasticism was in many ways right on. But if we go back early enough, we can see, well, okay, so the intent was pretty good. In the first few centuries, we often think of the first few centuries of the Christian church as being a time of great persecution. And it's better to see it as sporadic persecution. Depending on what time you lived and where, it could be incredibly intense and difficult. And other times you would not really be in danger of losing your life. But Christianity was looked on with great suspicion. And there were lots of opportunities in life, business opportunities, political opportunities, social opportunities, that you had to engage in pagan practices in order to take advantage of those opportunities. So being a Christian meant you had to give things up. You just had to. There's no way around it. You had to make sacrifices. You had to deny yourself. But people were also very intent on following Jesus, in caring for the poor, in prayer, in studying the Word, and copying the Word, and dispensing the Word, and preaching the gospel. So there was sort of built into Christian life these disciplines. I'm not saying that everybody did them well, but I'm just saying that it was almost more natural. You had to sort of devote yourself if you're going to do this.
It was necessary.
It was necessary.
If you were to live as a believer and have healthy faith and endure what it was going to ask you, it necessitated the disciplines.
Exactly. So this is important background because what happens then in the 300s is Christianity in the early 300s, Christianity is made legal. And the pressure the intense pressure is off. And then in the mid 300s, it had become popular. And by the end of the century, it was actually officially mandated by law. So now what you have is masses of people flooding into the church. And now suddenly you could be a member in good standing in the church. You could be considered you're a Christian and you didn't have to sacrifice. You could prosper, live a life of luxury and ease. You could be have great political power. You could go to all the great parties. And all these things, other Christians are like, wow, is that really a Christian life? I don't know. At the bare minimum, it's really distracting people from really devoting themselves to it's distracting people from prayer, distracting people from really good fellowship, distracting people, so at its worst, it's outright sin. At its best, it tends to be just distracting. So, and tempting also, right? Very, very, very tempting. So how do you deal with this? Well, you separate yourself and you go off by yourself and you devote yourself to prayer and fasting and everything that you're supposed to do. Or you form a community. Eventually communities form. And we're going to be sort of, on our own, and we're going to go back to how Christianity really was supposed to be. And we don't really live in a hostile world, but at least we can keep each other accountable. We can really practice these things and together we can encourage each other. And we'll have like these little monastic communities that are devoted to how everybody really should be living. But like I said before, they begin to turn up the volume intensively. And that's where we kind of get into some excesses and some problems.
Well, let's just take that a little bit further then. What was then the correction of the Reformation?
So there were several major issues with monasticism. And some of these, by the way, were recognized by monastic leaders themselves. And they would periodically try to purge their monasteries from these excesses or these problems. But it's a fair criticism by the Protestants, a very fair criticism. One was that instead of being a life of devotion, here's where I think Isaac's comment earlier was really important. Instead of being the purpose is to really know God and follow him through prayer and study of the word and meditation, that sort of thing, loving others by serving them selflessly and sacrificially, instead of those being good ends to really love and serve Christ, it became a way of sort of achieving merit with God. So if the more prayer I have, the less time I'll spend in purgatory, the more likely it will be that I get to heaven. And in fact, if I'm really good at this, I can build up merits for other people. Like I can actually build up an excess of goodness that then somehow God can sort of assign to other people, and it will save other people. That's a pretty dangerous path to walk down, right? Yeah. And then another outcome, probably the thing that bothered most people the most, like the average people. The first one, building up merits was something that Protestant theologians really worried about. But among the masses, the thing that really irritated people in the Protestant Reformation was that one way, if I think of being a monk as a surefire way to get into heaven, okay, that's great, but what if I don't really want to do that? What if I don't think I have the courage to do it, the constancy to do it? Hey, I know when I die, I can leave my massive estate to the monastery, and that will count to my credit. That will build up merits for me. Well, you get a lot of people doing this, and pretty soon monasteries end up being massive, wealthy landowners. And average people, if you go back 1,000 years, chances are you're a farmer, and chances are you work on a monastery's land, and they're just charging lots of money, a rent, and meanwhile, they're kind of living in luxury, right? I mean, this is a really good deal for them. So there's theological problems. There's very practical, sort of in your face, just kind of, earthly problems that most people experience. And the Protestants want to correct both of those. The problem is what ends up happening is their initial intent to be people of prayer and love of God and love of neighbor gets sort of bunched in, gets associated with monasteries, so that the disciplines belong in the monastic category, right? And the ideal is that we just sort of take the Christian life more as it comes, because being disciplined is a monastic thing. So we can critique the excesses. Unfortunately, it wasn't just critiquing the excesses. Too often, the actual disciplines got dumped out.
And so some of what got thrown off during the Reformation was this monastic order as being exalted as deeply spiritual. And by throwing that off, for the reasons that you've articulated here, in so doing, we've somewhat emptied ourselves of the needs of spiritual disciplines, or at least having them as a revered mechanism or process by which we access God.
Yes. One of the things that Protestants also critiqued was this notion that developed in the Middle Ages, that to be a real Christian, you're a monk, a priest, you're one of these super devoted people. Everybody else just kind of, you just can't expect much out of them. Well, one of the Protestant critiques was, nowhere in the Bible does it say we have two levels of Christians, like the really good Christians and then kind of the sort of barely Christians. We're all supposed to be living holy lives.
Isaac, I'd like you to speak to this notion that, there has been kind of spiritual disciplines afresh here. Maybe there's more books on it now in the last 10 years than maybe there would have been in the last 100. Is this the 2020 something spiritual bandwagon?
Yeah, you do want to be careful of the faddishness, I suppose, of certain things that come up. I think that this part of why this conversation is so important is if we're able to frame it up in its historical context, which I feel like Fred has been able to do really well for us, that can help us understand its proper place. But you're right. Right now, there's always a new book, a new podcast, a new series out on discipline, or spiritual formation, or fasting from technology, slowing down, all of these spiritual discipline-esque sort of ideas. And I think one of the dangers with that now is if those become something that is going to be just individually consumed or practiced only in isolation, which is often how these things are being delivered, then it will surely fizzle out and die. And it will and then it'll be a passing thing again. And people are going to say, see, look, it didn't matter anyway. Just another passing fad in the church. But if we can find a way to get these into the life of the local church, where these things are done in the body of Christ with the people that you're doing life with, that's where the life comes from, is doing these sort of things in community with other people. They will die if done in isolation, and they will not have their full effect And in fact, they'll probably have a lot of negative effects if done in isolation. But if you can do them in a group, if you can do them with a body of Christ followers, a group of disciples together, then I think a transformative life can be found there.
I think one of the fears, and I think it's a legitimate fear, is that sometimes this can come across as sort of the kind of self-actualization thing, right? Like, I spend time in meditation to get in touch with my inner self. And it has a direction to it that is I think, pretty dangerous. This isn't about self-actualization. This isn't just about feeling good about me and my life. And if I keep that community aspect, it seems like that's kind of a guardrail to make sure we don't go off into that ditch. Am I right? Is that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. If you find something like silence and solitude to be really easy for you, and perhaps it's a really enjoyable thing because it becomes kind of like me time, right? In community, you're going to find that there's a whole lot of other disciplines that you'll need to be engaging with, like fellowship and service. And those things will be probably the more difficult ones for you, but those are the ones you need to spend the more time doing then. So,
and by the way, what I said does not mean to deny that there aren't personal benefits to it. But
agreed, right?
I think it's a huge difference between what we're talking about and kind of the really faddish sort of secularized, get in touch with yourself movement.
Right. Yeah. To see the end, if we're treating them as a means to an end, the end of being yourself, a better you, that's going to be a problem. Yeah. Perhaps the positive thing that it's identifying is that, well, we can't just be passive Christians. And I think people are starting to catch on to that again. Like we kind of tried that, we took I'm saved by grace through faith as I don't have to do anything now. And we've misinterpreted certain scriptures that way. And what we find is that we end up leading really dull, powerless lives. And you end up getting stuck in a lot of really sad addiction things and just sin struggles that could be dealt with. But yeah, this idea of just giving mental assent is just not enough. Your salvation is your life. Your salvation is your life. You're saved, every part of you.
That's good.
As I read the Bible, I sense just what you're saying. Christianity is something more than just staying away from certain sins and going to church now and then and that sort of thing. And I love what it looks like. I just love the vision that the New Testament casts. And that is the attraction of the disciplines. Paul and Silas in Philippi, they get beaten up, they get seized, brought before the magistrates. The magistrates, it says, tore the clothes off them, gave orders to beat them with rods. They beat them up with rods, threw them into prison, in the inner prison, fastened them in the stocks. And this is a dark, horrible place. And the next verse says, and about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God. If we keep it attached to the Gospels, which is the story of the 3 years they spent in training with Jesus, keeping those connected, they did that because they were trained.
I'm going to throw in a quote from one of my favorite authors on this subject, Dallas Willard. And he has this really famous, probably his most famous quote is that grace is opposed to earning, but it's not opposed to effort. And I think that the spontaneity comes from this idea that if it's going to be done by grace, it's going to be done spontaneously. I think that misunderstanding can cause some harm. It's opposed to earning, but it's not opposed to effort. So you actually do something. Jesus said, without me, you can do nothing. And that is absolutely true. And the flip side of that is if you do nothing, it will be without Jesus, like do something and let it be done with Christ. Yeah,
and to our listeners, I hope that you have caught the same hope that I have as well. And perhaps many other things from this conversation about spiritual disciplines. Are there some ditches? Absolutely. Absolutely. But there is a beautiful path forward when we recognize that the spiritual disciplines are a means to an end and not the end themselves. And the end that they point us towards and they bring us towards, and that is to the life of Christ and to a relationship with Him and to following Him, why they're very welcome. So thanks for being on.